The day I found out my parents had given my entire inheritance to my sister was the same day I decided to teach them all a lesson they'd never forget. What they didn't know was that her husband had been desperately looking for work for months, and I was about to become his new boss. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Marcus Thompson, and for 28 years, I believed my family actually cared about fairness. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, I was the responsible one. While my sister Jessica spent her college years partying and switching majors 3 times, I was grinding through engineering school with a 3.8 GPA. While she moved back home after graduation and lived rent-free for 2 years, I was working 60-hour weeks at a tech startup, building my career from the ground up. The contrast between us couldn't have been starker. Jessica had this way of floating through life, expecting everything to work out without putting in real effort. She'd charm her way out of consequences, bat her eyelashes when things got tough, and somehow always land on her feet. Meanwhile, I was the one who showed up early, stayed late, and never asked for handouts. Our parents, Robert and Linda Thompson, owned a successful chain of hardware stores across the Pacific Northwest. 3 locations that Dad had built from nothing over 30 years. Growing up, he'd always told me stories about taking over the business someday, about how hard work and dedication would pay off in the end. I'd spent summers working in those stores, learning every aspect of the operation, from inventory management to customer service. Jessica, on the other hand, couldn't even be bothered to show up for her scheduled shifts. She'd call in sick, make excuses, or simply not appear without any explanation. Yet somehow, she remained the golden child in our parents' eyes. When I turned 25, I made what I thought was a smart financial decision. I took out a substantial loan to start my own consulting firm, specializing in supply chain optimization for small businesses. It was risky, but I had the expertise and the drive to make it work. What I needed was initial capital to get established, cover office space, hire a small team, and build a client base. I approached my parents about an early inheritance. Not a gift, not a handout, but an advance on what I'd eventually receive anyway. I presented them with a detailed business plan, financial projections, and a timeline for paying back every penny with interest. This wasn't some desperate plea for money. It was a calculated business proposition from their son who had never asked them for anything. The response was lukewarm at best. Dad hemmed and hawed about cash flow issues with the stores. Mom worried about setting precedents and fairness between siblings. They needed time to think about it, they said. Time to discuss it between themselves. Meanwhile, Jessica had recently married Derek Hoffman, a guy she'd met at a coffee shop who had big dreams but no concrete skills to back them up. Derek was one of those people who talked a good game about entrepreneurship and disruption, but had never actually built anything. He'd had a string of failed ventures, a food truck that lasted 3 months, an online clothing brand that never sold a single item, and, most recently, a cryptocurrency trading scheme that lost him what little savings he had. 6 months after my loan request was denied, Jessica casually mentioned over Sunday dinner that she and Derek were looking at houses. Not just any houses, but a gorgeous craftsman-style home in one of Portland's most desirable neighborhoods. The kind of place that would require a down payment of at least $200,000. I remember sitting at that dinner table, my fork halfway to my mouth, when she dropped the bombshell. "Oh, and thanks again for the help with the down payment, Mom and Dad. We never could have afforded this place without you." The room went silent. I looked at my parents, waiting for some explanation, some context that would make this make sense. But the uncomfortable glances they exchanged told me everything I needed to know. "How much help are we talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Dad cleared his throat. "Well, son, we decided to give Jessica and Derek her inheritance early. They're starting a family, and they needed the stability of homeownership. $250,000. That's what they'd given her. No business plan required, no interest rates, no timeline for paying it back. Just $250,000 handed over because she needed stability. The same amount I'd asked to borrow, with interest and a detailed repayment plan, had been given to her as a gift. While I was grinding to build something meaningful, she was getting rewarded for simply existing and making poor life choices. But the real kicker came 3 weeks later, during another family dinner that I almost didn't attend. Jessica was going on about Derek's latest business idea, some vague concept about consulting for small businesses that sounded suspiciously similar to what I was already doing. "The thing is," Derek said, gesturing with his beer bottle, "I've got all these great ideas, but I need to find the right opportunity. Someone who really understands talent and can give me the platform to succeed." That's when the plan started forming in my mind. Derek needed a job. He needed someone who understood talent and could give him opportunities. And I was about to become exactly the person he was looking for. My consulting firm had grown significantly over the past 2 years. We'd landed several major clients, expanded our team to 12 people, and opened a second office. I was actively hiring for multiple positions, including a junior consultant role that would be perfect for someone with Derek's enthusiasm. The beauty of it was that Derek had no idea I owned the company. He knew I worked in consulting, but Jessica had never bothered to learn the specifics of what I did or where I worked. To them, I was just Marcus, who had some boring office job and talked too much about spreadsheets at family gatherings. I spent the next week crafting the perfect job posting. Senior Business Development Associate. That title would appeal to Derek's ego. The salary was decent, the benefits package attractive, and the job description vague enough that he'd think he could coast while figuring things out. Within 48 hours of posting, Derek's resume landed in my inbox. The irony was almost too perfect. Here was the man who'd married into my inheritance, applying to work for the company I'd built without that money, completely unaware that I'd be the one deciding his fate. His resume was exactly what I expected. A collection of failed ventures presented as entrepreneurial experience and gaps in employment described as, quote, consulting periods. But it didn't matter, I wasn't hiring him for his qualifications. I scheduled the interview for the following Thursday, making sure to have my assistant Rachel handle all the communication. Derek would walk into that conference room expecting to meet some generic hiring manager, only to find his brother-in-law sitting across the table with a very different kind of opportunity in mind. The morning of the interview, I arrived at the office early and spent extra time preparing. This wasn't just about a job, this was about justice. This was about showing my family that actions have consequences, and that the responsible son they'd overlooked was now in a position to call the shots. At exactly 2 p.m., Rachel knocked on my door. "Derek Hoffman is here for his interview." I straightened my tie, opened the folder containing his pathetic resume, and smiled. "Send him in." The look on Derek's face when he walked into my conference room was absolutely priceless. His confident stride faltered mid-step, and I watched his brain struggle to process what he was seeing. His mouth opened, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. "Marcus?" he stammered, clutching his leather portfolio against his chest. "What are you? Are you conducting your interview?" "Yes." I gestured to the chair across from me with the same professional courtesy I'd show any candidate. "Please, have a seat, Derek. We have a lot to discuss." He sat down slowly, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for hidden cameras. The conference room was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Portland, a polished mahogany table, and awards from various business organizations lining the walls. This wasn't some small-time operation, and I could see him realizing that for the first time. "I had no idea you owned Thomson Strategic Solutions," he said, trying to regain his composure. "There's a lot you don't know about me, Derek." I opened his resume and made a show of reviewing it, even though I'd memorized every embellished detail. "Let's start with your qualifications for this position." For the next hour, I put him through the most thorough interview of his life. I asked detailed questions about his failed food truck venture, probing into the financial decisions that led to its collapse. I made him walk me through his online clothing brand debacle, questioning every marketing strategy and operational choice. By the time I got to his cryptocurrency trading fiasco, beads of sweat were forming on his forehead. The beautiful thing was that I wasn't being cruel or unprofessional. I was simply doing what any competent hiring manager would do, thoroughly vetting a candidate's background and experience. The fact that Derek's background couldn't withstand basic scrutiny wasn't my fault. "Tell me about your long-term career goals," I said, leaning back in my chair. Derek straightened up, sensing an opportunity to redeem himself. "Well, I'm really passionate about helping businesses optimize their operations. I see myself growing within an organization, maybe eventually leading my own team or division. I nodded thoughtfully. That's interesting. And what specific skills do you bring to achieve those goals? The question hung in the air. Derek fumbled through a response about being a people person and having innovative thinking, but we both knew he was grasping at straws. His entire professional history was a series of abandoned projects and half-baked ideas. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Despite everything, I offered him the job. Not out of kindness, but because unemployed Derek served no purpose in my long-term plan. I needed him working for me, dependent on me, and most importantly, answerable to me. His starting salary was $45,000. Decent money for someone with his lack of qualifications, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle that my parents' $250,000 gift had enabled. The mortgage on that Craftsman house Jessica had bought was steep, and without a steady income, they'd been dipping into what remained of the inheritance money just to cover basic expenses. Derek's first day was a Monday morning in early November. I'd assigned him to work under Sarah Chen, one of my most demanding senior consultants. Sarah had built her reputation on precision, efficiency, and zero tolerance for incompetence. If Derek was going to survive at Thomson Strategic Solutions, he'd have to prove himself to her first. I watched from my office as Derek struggled through his orientation. Simple tasks that should have taken minutes stretched into hours. A basic client report that I'd assigned as a getting-to-know-you project came back riddled with errors, formatting issues, and factual inaccuracies that would have embarrassed a college intern. By Wednesday of his first week, Sarah was already in my office expressing concerns. "Marcus, I don't know what you see in this guy, but he's not cut out for consulting work," she said, closing my office door behind her. "Yesterday he spent 3 hours on a spreadsheet that should have taken 30 minutes, and he still got the formulas wrong." I feigned disappointment. "That's unfortunate to hear. What would you recommend?" "Honestly, cut your losses now before he damages our reputation with clients." But I couldn't do that. Derek needed to stay employed just long enough for phase 2 of my plan to unfold. "Give him another week," I said. "Sometimes people just need time to adjust to our systems." Sarah shook her head but agreed to give him more time. What she didn't know was that I was setting Derek up for something much more elaborate than simple workplace failure. That evening, Derek showed up at my apartment unannounced. I lived in a sleek downtown loft, the kind of place that screamed success and independence. When I answered the door, he looked haggard and defeated. "Marcus, we need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the living room. "About what?" I asked, genuinely curious about what angle he'd try to work. "This whole situation is weird, man. You're my brother-in-law, and now you're my boss. Jessica thinks there's something going on." I poured myself a glass of wine and didn't offer him one. "What exactly does Jessica think is going on?" "She thinks you're trying to get back at us for something. She keeps saying you've been acting strange since we bought the house." Smart woman, my sister. Not smart enough to realize the extent of what I had planned, but smart enough to sense that something was off. "Derek, I'm going to be completely honest with you," I said, settling into my leather armchair. "When you applied for this job, I could have easily passed your resume to someone else and avoided any family complications. But I didn't. Do you know why?" He shook his head. "Because despite everything, you're family, and I believe in giving family members opportunities to prove themselves." I paused for effect. "The question is, are you going to prove yourself worthy of this opportunity? Or are you going to let personal feelings interfere with your professional performance?" It was a masterful manipulation. I'd made him feel guilty for questioning my motives while simultaneously putting the pressure on him to succeed in a job he was clearly failing at. Derek left my apartment that night more confused than when he'd arrived, but also more determined to make things work. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched Derek struggle with increasing desperation. He started staying late, trying to catch up on projects that more competent employees could complete in half the time. He'd ask Sarah endless questions about procedures and protocols, clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of real consulting work. The breaking point came during a client presentation in late November. I had deliberately assigned Derek to assist with a pitch to Morrison Manufacturing, a mid-sized company looking to streamline their supply chain operations. It was exactly the kind of project that would showcase either competence or incompetence in spectacular fashion. The presentation was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at Morrison's headquarters across town. Sarah had prepared meticulously, as always, creating detailed slides and analysis that demonstrated our firm's expertise. Derek's role was simple. He was supposed to present one section about implementation timelines and answer basic questions about project phases. I arrived at Morrison's offices 30 minutes early, ostensibly to ensure everything was set up properly. In reality, I wanted a front row seat to watch Derek either rise to the occasion or crash and burn in front of potential clients. What happened exceeded even my expectations. Derek showed up 15 minutes late, looking frazzled and carrying a coffee-stained folder. His section of the presentation was a disaster. He stumbled over basic terminology, couldn't answer simple questions about our methodology, and at one point actually contradicted information that Sarah had presented just minutes earlier. The Morrison executives exchanged glances that said everything. These were serious business people who valued competence and professionalism. Derek was neither. After the presentation, Sarah and I regrouped in the parking lot while Derek sat in his car, probably contemplating his career prospects. "That was a complete embarrassment," Sarah said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Marcus, I like you, and I respect your judgment, but this guy is going to cost us clients if we don't do something soon." She was right, of course. But losing the Morrison account was a small price to pay for the larger game I was playing. Besides, Thomson Strategic Solutions was profitable enough to absorb the occasional setback. "I'll handle Derek," I assured her. "This can't happen again." That evening, I called Derek into my office for what he probably assumed would be a termination meeting. Instead, I offered him something unexpected, a chance at redemption. "Derek, today didn't go well," I began, watching him shift uncomfortably in his chair. "I know, Marcus. I'm sorry. I've been struggling to get up to speed, and I held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not here to make excuses or assign blame. I'm here to offer you a solution." His eyes lit up with desperate hope. "There's a special project I've been considering. Something that would play to your strengths rather than highlighting your weaknesses," I continued. "It would involve more independence, less direct oversight, and the kind of entrepreneurial thinking you've always claimed to excel at." Derek leaned forward eagerly. "What kind of project?" Quote. I smiled, knowing that I was about to offer him exactly what he thought he wanted, while giving myself exactly what I needed to complete my revenge. "I want you to open a new branch office for Thomson Strategic Solutions in Sacramento." Sacramento. The word hung in the air like a death sentence disguised as a promotion. I watched Derek's face cycle through confusion, excitement, and then the dawning realization of what I was actually offering him. "Sacramento?" he repeated, as if saying it again might somehow change the location to somewhere more appealing. That's 4 hours away from Portland." 3.5 if traffic cooperates," I corrected with a smile. "It's a tremendous opportunity, Derek. You'd be the branch manager, responsible for building our Central California client base from the ground up. Complete autonomy, your own team, and a chance to prove that entrepreneurial spirit you're always talking about." The beauty of the offer was in its apparent generosity. To anyone listening, it sounded like I was rewarding Derek's potential, rather than punishing his incompetence. In reality, I was solving multiple problems at once. Derek would be far enough away that his continued failures wouldn't directly impact our Portland operations. Jessica would be forced to choose between following her husband to a city where she knew nobody, or watching their marriage crumble under the strain of long-distance living. And most importantly, I'd have Derek exactly where I wanted him, isolated, dependent, and completely under my control. "What about Jessica?" he asked, the first intelligent question he'd posed since starting at the company. "Her whole family is here, her job, her friends." "That's something you'll need to discuss with your wife," I said, maintaining my professional tone. "But I should mention that this position comes with a significant salary increase, $75,000 plus performance bonuses and a generous relocation package." The money was the hook. Derek and Jessica had been burning through the remainder of their inheritance faster than they'd anticipated. The mortgage payments on their Craftsman house were steep, and Derek's previous unemployment had forced them to dip into their savings for basic living expenses. An extra $30,000 per year wasn't life-changing money, but it was enough to make the proposition seem legitimate. Derek asked for time to think about it, which I'd expected. That evening, I imagined the conversation he'd have with Jessica, how he'd frame this as a career opportunity rather than what it really was, exile with a paycheck attached. The next morning, my assistant Rachel buzzed my intercom. "Derek Hoffman is here to see you. He says it's urgent." I kept him waiting for exactly 10 minutes before allowing him into my office. Derek looked like he hadn't slept, which probably meant he'd spent the night arguing with Jessica about the Sacramento offer. "I'll take the position," he said without preamble, slumping into the chair across from my desk, "but I have some conditions." Conditions. From the man whose resume was a monument to professional failure. I almost laughed, but maintained my composure. "I'm listening." "I want a company car, and I want Jessica involved in setting up the office, maybe as an assistant manager or something. She has experience in customer service." Derek was trying to negotiate from a position of weakness, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. His desperation was making him overreach, giving me even more leverage than I'd originally planned. "The company car is standard for branch managers," I said, making a note on my pad. "As for Jessica, we'll need to see her resume and conduct a proper interview process. I can't make hiring decisions based on family relationships." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on either of us, but Derek was in no position to point it out. 2 weeks later, Derek was loading a U-Haul truck in front of the Craftsman house that my parents' money had bought. Jessica stood on the porch, arms crossed, looking like she was attending a funeral rather than embarking on a new adventure. Their neighbors, people they barely knew after less than a year in the house, offered polite waves and empty promises to stay in touch. I made a point of stopping by to see them off, playing the role of the supportive brother-in-law. I even brought coffee and donuts for the road, a gesture that would have seemed thoughtful if anyone knew what I was really thinking. "This is going to be great for both of you," I told Jessica, handing her a cup of coffee. "Sacramento's a growing market, lots of opportunities." Jessica took the coffee but didn't drink it. She'd been quiet since Derek accepted the position, and I could see the resentment building behind her eyes. She knew something was wrong with this whole situation, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what. "Why are you doing this, Marcus?" she asked quietly, while Derek was distracted with securing furniture in the truck. "Doing what?" "Helping Derek. You've never liked him, and suddenly you're handing him a promotion and a raise? It doesn't make sense." Smart woman, my sister. Not smart enough to prevent what was coming, but smart enough to sense the trap closing around her. "Maybe I'm just trying to be a better brother," I said, meeting her gaze directly. "Maybe I realized that families should support each other, especially when someone's trying to build a better life." The words were carefully chosen. Jessica couldn't argue against family support without sounding ungrateful, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to my motivations than simple generosity. An hour later, Derek's U-Haul disappeared down the street, taking with it the last remnants of the inheritance that should have been mine. But I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was a waste of energy when you had a plan. The Sacramento branch of Thomson Strategic Solutions officially opened 3 weeks later in a modest office complex near the downtown business district. Derek had found what he thought was a good location: affordable rent, decent foot traffic, and proximity to potential clients. What he didn't realize was that I'd been steering his choices from the beginning, feeding him information about available properties through carefully orchestrated conversations. The office space Derek had chosen was perfect for my purposes, but not for the reasons he thought. It was in a building owned by Peninsula Properties, a real estate company that happened to be one of my consulting clients. The building manager, Patricia Hendricks, owed me several favors from a project I'd completed for her the previous year. One phone call to Patricia was all it took to ensure that Derek's tenancy would be challenging. "I need you to be completely professional about this," I told Patricia during our conversation. "But if there are any issues with the lease, any problems with building maintenance, any concerns about noise or disruptions to other tenants, I trust you'll handle them according to standard building policies." Patricia understood perfectly. She'd been in property management long enough to know how to create problems for troublesome tenants without crossing any legal lines. Derek's first month in Sacramento was rough but not catastrophic. He managed to land two small clients: a local accounting firm that needed basic file organization and a family restaurant looking to streamline their inventory system. Neither project was particularly complex or profitable, but they were enough to justify the branch's existence on paper. Jessica, meanwhile, was struggling with the isolation. She'd found part-time work at a boutique clothing store, but it was a far cry from the life she'd built in Portland. Her friends were 4 hours away, her parents were 4 hours away, and she was spending her days folding clothes and making small talk with strangers. The cracks in their marriage began showing almost immediately. Derek would call me every few days with updates on his progress, but the conversations gradually shifted from professional reports to personal complaints. Jessica was unhappy. Jessica missed Portland. Jessica thought they'd made a mistake moving to Sacramento. Maybe she just needs more time to adjust, I'd suggest during these calls, playing the supportive boss. Moving to a new city is always difficult, but I'm sure she'll settle in once she makes some friends. What I didn't mention was that I'd been carefully monitoring the Sacramento market, identifying Derek's potential competitors, and, when possible, warning them about Thomson Strategic Solutions' new branch. Not directly, of course. That would have been too obvious. But a few strategic conversations with other business owners in the area had created a subtle but effective resistance to Derek's efforts. The breakthrough came in early February, when Patricia Hendricks called to inform me about a situation at Derek's office building. "Your man has been complained about by 3 other tenants," she said, barely concealing her amusement. "Apparently he's been playing music too loudly, taking personal calls in the hallway, and leaving food trash in the common areas." None of these violations were serious enough to warrant eviction, but they were perfect for creating ongoing friction. Patricia had documented each complaint carefully, building a paper trail that would justify increasingly strict enforcement of building policies. "I'll need to have a conversation with him about professional conduct," I told Patricia. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention." That afternoon, I called Derek to discuss his, quote, performance issues. The conversation was a masterclass in controlled disappointment. I expressed concern about the building complaints, questioned his client acquisition strategies, and subtly implied that the Sacramento branch was underperforming compared to my expectations. "I'm doing my best, Marcus," Derek said, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. "This market is tougher than we anticipated. People here are more conservative, less willing to try new consulting services." "I understand that markets can be challenging," I replied, "but part of being a successful branch manager is adapting to local conditions. Maybe we need to reassess your approach." The seed of doubt was planted. Derek was starting to question his own abilities, wondering if maybe he wasn't cut out for the responsibility I'd given him. Which was exactly where I wanted him, uncertain, anxious, and increasingly dependent on my guidance. 2 weeks later, Jessica made her first trip back to Portland. She claimed it was just a weekend visit to see family and friends, but Derek called me in a panic the night before she was supposed to return to Sacramento. "She's not coming back," he said, his voice cracking with stress. "She wants to stay in Portland. She says she made a mistake moving to Sacramento, and she's not cut out for this kind of life." I let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing Derek to fully absorb the implications of what he'd just told me. "What are you going to do?" I asked finally. And in that question, Derek heard exactly what I'd intended, the sound of his world falling apart, one carefully orchestrated piece at a time. Derek's voice on the phone that night was barely above a whisper. "Marcus, I need your advice. I don't know what to do." Jessica had been back in Portland for 5 days, staying at our parents' house and showing no signs of returning to Sacramento. Derek had called her repeatedly, alternating between pleading and anger, but she remained unmoved. The marriage that had been built on my parents' generosity was crumbling under the weight of real-world pressure. "Have you considered couples counseling?" I suggested, playing the concerned brother-in-law perfectly. "Long-distance relationships are incredibly difficult, even for married couples." "She won't even talk to me about counseling," Derek said. "Every time I bring up our future together, she changes the subject or hangs up. I think she wants a divorce." Quote, the word hung in the air like a victory bell. Derek's marriage was disintegrating exactly as I'd hoped, but I couldn't appear too satisfied with this development. Instead, I made appropriate sympathetic noises. and offered to have a conversation with Jessica the next time I saw her. What Derek didn't know was that I'd already spoken with Jessica twice since she'd returned to Portland. Our parents had asked me to intervene, hoping I could convince her to work things out with Derek. Instead, I'd carefully validated every complaint she'd made about their life in Sacramento. "You're absolutely right to be concerned about your future," I told her during our first conversation. "Marriage is about partnership, and partners should make major decisions together. Derek accepted that job without really considering how it would affect you." "Exactly," Jessica had responded, grateful to have someone finally understand her perspective. "He keeps saying it's a great opportunity, but an opportunity for who? I'm the one who had to leave everything behind." I nodded sympathetically, while internally celebrating the wedge I was driving between them. "Have you thought about what you want to do long term? Because staying in limbo isn't fair to either of you." By the end of that conversation, Jessica was already talking about separation. By the end of the second conversation, she was researching divorce attorneys. Meanwhile, Derek's professional situation in Sacramento was deteriorating rapidly. The two small clients he'd managed to acquire were both expressing dissatisfaction with his work. The accounting firm had complained about missed deadlines and sloppy documentation. The restaurant owner had called Derek's inventory recommendations completely impractical and was threatening to demand a refund. Patricia Hendricks continued to find reasons to cite Derek for various building violations. His office lease required professional conduct, and Patricia had decided that Derek's increasingly erratic behavior warranted closer scrutiny. She'd documented everything. The day he'd shouted at Jessica during a phone call loud enough for other tenants to hear, the afternoon he'd left early without locking his office properly, and the morning she'd found him sleeping on his office couch. "I'm concerned about his mental state," Patricia told me during one of our weekly check-ins. "He looks terrible, and some of the other tenants are starting to feel uncomfortable around him." Quote, "This was exactly the kind of feedback I'd been hoping for. Derek was spiraling, and everyone around him could see it happening. When the inevitable termination came, no one would be surprised. But I needed Derek to fail more spectacularly than simple professional decline. I needed him to make a mistake so egregious that it would justify not just firing him, but potentially legal action. That's when I introduced the Riverside Manufacturing opportunity." Riverside Manufacturing was a mid-sized company in Sacramento that specialized in precision automotive parts. They'd been struggling with supply chain inefficiencies for months, and their CEO, Richard Yamamoto, was actively seeking consulting help. More importantly, Richard was a former colleague of mine from my engineering days, and he owed me several professional favors. I called Richard on a Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to catch up on old times. "Richard, I wanted to let you know that my Sacramento branch manager might be reaching out to you soon," I said during our conversation. "Derek Hoffman. He's relatively new to consulting, but he's eager to prove himself." "Always happy to help out Thompson Strategic Solutions," Richard replied. "Your Portland team did excellent work for us a few years ago." "I appreciate that. Derek's situation is a bit unique. He's going through some personal challenges right now, so he might seem a little intense during your initial meetings. But I wanted to give him this opportunity to show what he can do." Richard assured me he'd give Derek fair consideration, not realizing that I'd just set up a scenario where Derek's increasingly desperate behavior would be interpreted as unprofessional intensity rather than concerning instability. Derek called me that Friday, more excited than I'd heard him in weeks. "Marcus, I just got off the phone with Riverside Manufacturing. They want to meet with me next week about a major consulting contract. This could be exactly what the Sacramento branch needs to turn things around." "That sounds promising," I said, matching his enthusiasm perfectly. "What kind of timeline are they working with?" "Richard Yamamoto wants to see a preliminary analysis by the end of next week, with a full proposal the week after. It's aggressive, but if I can pull this off, it could be worth 6 figures in revenue." Derek was right about the potential value, but wrong about his ability to deliver. The Riverside project required exactly the kind of detailed technical analysis that had always been beyond his capabilities. Under normal circumstances, he might have asked for help or additional resources. But Derek was desperate to prove himself, and desperate people make predictable mistakes. I encouraged his confidence while subtly undermining his preparation. When he asked about similar projects we'd completed in Portland, I provided examples that were close enough to seem relevant, but different enough to lead him down the wrong analytical path. When he requested access to certain proprietary methodologies, I delayed responses or claimed the information was tied up in other projects. The meeting with Riverside Manufacturing took place on a Tuesday morning in late February. Derek had spent the entire weekend preparing, working 16-hour days to create what he thought was a comprehensive analysis of their supply chain problems. Richard called me that afternoon. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," he said, his tone serious. "Is Derek Hoffman actually qualified to be handling consulting projects of this magnitude?" My heart rate quickened, but I kept my voice calm. What happened during the meeting? His analysis was fundamentally flawed. He misidentified our primary bottlenecks, proposed solutions that would actually make our problems worse, and when I asked basic questions about his methodology, he gave answers that made no sense. Either he's completely incompetent, or he's dealing with some kind of substance abuse problem. "Richard, I'm mortified," I said, injecting genuine concern into my voice. "Derek has been under significant personal stress lately. His wife left him, and I think he's been struggling more than I realized. I should have postponed this meeting until he was in a better place mentally. I appreciate your honesty, but Marcus, this goes beyond personal stress. Some of the recommendations he made could have seriously damaged our operations if we'd followed them. I'm concerned about potential liability issues." Liability issues. The words I'd been hoping to hear. "What kind of liability issues?" I asked. Well, his proposal included modifications to our quality control processes that would have violated several industry regulations. If we'd implemented his recommendations and been audited, we could have faced significant fines or even lost our certifications. Quote, "This was better than I'd dared to hope. Derek hadn't just failed to win the contract. He'd potentially exposed both himself and Thomson Strategic Solutions to legal liability through grossly negligent consulting advice." "Richard, I need to investigate this immediately," I said. "Can you send me copies of everything Derek presented? I need to understand exactly what went wrong so I can take appropriate action." "Of course. Marcus, I've known you for years, and I know this isn't representative of your company's usual standards. But I have to document this incident, and if Derek tries to work with other manufacturers in the area, they need to know about these competency issues." After hanging up with Richard, I sat in my office for several minutes, processing what had just happened. Derek had made exactly the kind of catastrophic error I'd been hoping for, but the magnitude of his failure exceeded even my expectations. Not only had he botched a major contract opportunity, but he'd potentially created legal exposure that would justify immediate termination. That evening, Derek called me in a panic. "Marcus, something went wrong with the Riverside meeting. Richard Yamamoto seemed upset about my recommendations, but I don't understand why. I followed all the standard protocols we use in Portland." "Derek, I just got off the phone with Richard," I said, allowing disappointment to creep into my voice. "He's extremely concerned about the liability issues in your proposal." "Liability issues? What liability issues?" The genuine confusion in Derek's voice was almost sad. He truly didn't understand the magnitude of his professional failure, which made what came next feel almost merciful. "Derek, I need you to close the Sacramento office and return to Portland immediately. We need to have a serious conversation about your future with the company." "Close the office? Marcus, I can fix this. Give me another chance to—" "This isn't about second chances anymore," I interrupted. "This is about protecting Thomson Strategic Solutions from potential legal action. Pack up everything, forward your calls to the main office, and be in my conference room Thursday morning at 9 a.m. The silence on Derek's end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "Are you firing me?" he asked finally. "Thursday morning, Derek, 9 a.m., quote. I hung up before he could respond, leaving him to contemplate the ruins of his professional life in a Sacramento office that had never been anything more than an elaborate trap. Phase 1 of my revenge was complete. Derek's career was destroyed, his marriage was over, and he was about to lose the only income that had been keeping him and Jessica afloat financially. But I wasn't finished with him yet. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Portland weather that matched Derek's mood perfectly. I watched from my office window as he pulled into the parking garage in his company car, a silver sedan that he'd have to return along with everything else Thomson Strategic Solutions had provided him. Derek looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and he moved with the defeated shuffle of a man who knew his world was collapsing around him. When Rachel escorted him to the conference room, I let him wait for exactly 15 minutes before joining him. "Derek," I said, taking my seat across from him at the polished table where this had all begun 6 months earlier. "Thank you for making the drive up from Sacramento." "Marcus, before you say anything, I want you to know that I take full responsibility for what happened with Riverside Manufacturing," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I was under a lot of stress with Jessica leaving, and I made some errors in judgment. But I can learn from this. I can do better." I opened the folder in front of me, revealing copies of Derek's disastrous Riverside proposal, along with Richard Yamamoto's formal complaint letter. "Derek, this goes far beyond errors in judgment. Your recommendations would have violated federal manufacturing regulations. You advised them to eliminate safety protocols that are legally mandated. Do you understand the potential consequences?" Derek's face went pale. I didn't realize. I thought I was just streamlining their processes." "You thought wrong. Richard has already filed a formal complaint with the California Business Licensing Board. They're launching an investigation into whether Thomson Strategic Solutions should maintain our consulting license in the state." This was a slight exaggeration. Richard had mentioned documenting the incident, but no formal investigation had been launched yet. However, Derek had no way of knowing that, and the threat served my purposes perfectly. "My God, Marcus, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know you didn't mean for it to happen," I said, softening my tone slightly. "But intent doesn't matter when we're talking about regulatory violations and potential lawsuits. I have to think about protecting the company and our other employees." Derek nodded miserably, accepting his fate with the resignation of a man who'd run out of options. "However," I continued, watching his head snap up hopefully, "I'm not completely without sympathy for your situation. I know you've been going through personal difficulties, and I understand that people sometimes make poor decisions when they're under extreme stress." "Thank you for understanding, Marcus. I know I messed up, but—" "Let me finish," I interrupted. "I'm prepared to offer you a choice. Option 1. I terminate you immediately for cause, which means no severance package, no positive references, and a notation in your employment file about the regulatory violations. Option 2. You resign voluntarily, citing personal reasons, and I provide you with a neutral reference and 2 months of continued health insurance." Derek stared at me across the table, processing his options. Both choices led to the same destination, unemployment and professional disgrace, but one preserved a thin veneer of dignity. "What about the Sacramento office?" he asked. "I'll handle the closure personally. The lease will be terminated. Any remaining client obligations will be transferred to our Portland team, and we'll manage the transition to minimize damage to our reputation." Derek signed his resignation letter 20 minutes later, his signature shaky but legible. As he gathered his personal belongings from the Sacramento office supplies scattered around the conference room, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The man who'd benefited from my stolen inheritance was now facing the same kind of professional uncertainty I'd experienced when my parents denied my loan request. But Derek's story was far from over. 2 days after his resignation, Derek called me in a panic. "Marcus, I need your help. Jessica filed for divorce yesterday, and her lawyer is demanding immediate division of assets. They want to force the sale of the house. The Craftsman House. The beautiful Portland home that my parents' $250,000 gift had purchased. Jessica's divorce attorney had clearly advised her to liquidate their major assets quickly, before Derek could hide or squander anything." "I'm sorry to hear about the divorce," I said, maintaining appropriate sympathy. "But Derek, I'm not sure how I can help with your legal situation. You could talk to Jessica, maybe convince her to slow down the process. She's always respected your opinion." The irony was breathtaking. Derek was asking me to intervene in his divorce, not knowing that I'd been quietly encouraging Jessica's decision to leave him from the very beginning. "Derek, I don't think it's appropriate for me to get involved in your marital issues," I said. "But if you're concerned about the house, maybe you should consider whether holding on to it is realistic, given your current financial situation." That was the question Derek had been avoiding. Without his Thompson Strategic Solutions salary, he couldn't afford the mortgage payments on the Craftsman house. His unemployment benefits would cover basic living expenses, but not the hefty monthly payments on a premium property. "I can't just sell the house," Derek said desperately. "It's the only asset we have left. If I sell it now in a divorce proceeding, I'll lose everything." "What about refinancing?" I suggested. "Maybe you could restructure the mortgage payments to something more manageable." "I already tried. No bank will refinance without proof of steady income, and my credit score took a hit when I missed some payments last month." Derek was trapped in a classic financial death spiral. No job meant no income meant no mortgage payments, and no mortgage payments meant foreclosure. The house that was supposed to represent stability and success had become an anchor dragging him toward bankruptcy. That's when I made my final move. "Derek, I might have a solution for you," I said, as if the idea had just occurred to me. "What if I bought the house from you directly? No real estate agents, no lengthy marketing process, just a straightforward transaction between family members." The silence on Derek's end stretched for nearly a minute. "You want to buy our house?" he asked finally. "I've been looking for investment properties, and your house is in an excellent neighborhood. I could offer you a fair price, enough to pay off the mortgage and give you some cash to start over. It would solve your immediate financial problems and let you move forward with the divorce proceedings." Quote, "What kind of price are we talking about?" I'd done my research carefully. The house was worth approximately $400,000 in the current market, but Derek and Jessica owed $320,000 on the mortgage. In a normal sale, they'd net maybe $60,000 after paying off the loan and covering transaction costs. "I'm thinking $350,000, I said. "Cash offer, 30-day closing, no inspection contingencies." It was a lowball offer, but not insultingly so. Derek would walk away with about $30,000, enough to rent an apartment and cover basic expenses while he looked for new employment, but not enough to maintain anything resembling his previous lifestyle. "Marcus, that's incredibly generous of you," Derek said, relief evident in his voice. "I mean, given everything that's happened, I wasn't sure you'd even want to help." "You're still family," I replied, delivering the line with perfect sincerity. "And family helps family, especially during difficult times." The closing took place on a rainy Tuesday in early April. Derek sat across from me at the title company, signing document after document that transferred ownership of the Craftsman house from Derek and Jessica Hoffman to Marcus Thompson. Jessica didn't attend. Her lawyer handled her signature requirements separately, eager to finalize the asset division and move forward with the divorce proceedings. As Derek signed the final transfer deed, I couldn't help but think about the circular justice of the moment. The house that my parents' inheritance money had purchased was now mine, bought with profits from the consulting business I'd built without their help. Derek was walking away with a fraction of what the property was worth, while I was acquiring a valuable asset at below-market rates. "I really appreciate this, Marcus," Derek said as we left the title company. "I know this whole situation has been weird for everyone, but you've been more than fair with me. Just promise me you'll use this fresh start wisely," I said, shaking his hand on the sidewalk outside the building. "You're a smart guy, Derek. You just need to find the right opportunity." Derek nodded earnestly, not realizing that his fresh start was actually the final chapter of a carefully orchestrated downfall that had been months in the making. That evening, I stood in the living room of my new house, the house that should have been mine from the beginning. The hardwood floors gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight, and the built-in bookshelves begged to be filled with my collection of business and engineering texts. I poured myself a glass of wine and raised it in a silent toast to justice, to patience, and to the sweet satisfaction of watching a plan come together exactly as intended. But as I stood there in my victory, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that Derek's story wasn't finished yet. Men like Derek don't disappear quietly into unemployment and divorce. They scheme, they blame others for their failures, and they look for ways to reclaim what they've lost. Which meant that my own story might not be finished either. 3 months after buying the house, I received an unexpected phone call that would test just how complete my revenge had been. "Marcus, we need to talk." It was my father's voice, strained and formal in a way I hadn't heard since childhood. "Can you come over for dinner tonight? Your mother and I have something important to discuss with you." I arrived at my parents' house that evening to find them both sitting rigidly in the living room, looking like they were preparing for a difficult conversation. Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting she'd been crying recently. Dad looked older than his 62 years, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching shame. "Marcus, sit down," Dad said, gesturing to the armchair across from them. "We owe you an explanation." "An explanation about what?" Mom dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "About Jessica, about Derek, about the inheritance money." For a moment, I thought they'd somehow discovered my role in Derek's downfall. But as Dad began speaking, it became clear they'd reached their own conclusions about what had happened. "We made a terrible mistake giving Jessica that money," Dad said heavily. "We thought we were helping her build a stable life, but instead we enabled her to make poor decisions and marry someone who wasn't worthy of our trust." "Robert, don't put this all on Derek," Mom interjected. "We're the ones who chose to give them the money without thinking it through properly." Dad nodded reluctantly. "Your mother's right. We got caught up in the excitement of Jessica's engagement and the idea of helping them buy a house. We didn't consider how unfair it was to you, or whether Derek had actually earned that kind of support." I maintained a neutral expression, letting them work through their guilt without offering reassurance. This conversation had been inevitable once Derek's failures became public knowledge, but I wanted to hear exactly how much they understood about the consequences of their decision. "The thing is," Mom continued, "we've been watching what happened to Derek and Jessica over the past year, and we can't help but feel responsible. If we hadn't given them that money, maybe they would have built their relationship on a stronger foundation. Or maybe Derek would have shown his true character earlier, before Jessica married him," Dad added. "Either way, we enabled a situation that hurt everyone involved." They went on to explain how the divorce proceedings had revealed the full extent of Derek's financial irresponsibility. Beyond losing his job and the house, Derek had accumulated significant credit card debt and had been making poor investment decisions with what remained of the inheritance money. Jessica had discovered that he'd been day trading cryptocurrency without telling her, losing thousands of dollars in speculative bets. "Jessica's moving back in with us temporarily," Mom said. "She's trying to rebuild her life, but she's starting from scratch. No savings, no house, and a failed marriage on her record." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it more than they could know. Jessica's suffering hadn't been the primary goal of my plan, but it was an inevitable consequence of Derek's destruction. Dad leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Marcus, we want to make this right with you. We know we should have considered your loan request more seriously, and we want to rectify that mistake." Here it was, the apology I'd been waiting for, arriving exactly when it no longer mattered. "We're prepared to give you the equivalent of what we gave Jessica," Dad continued. $250,000, no strings attached. You can use it however you see fit, for your business, for investments, for whatever you need." The offer hung in the air between us. $250,000, the same amount that had started this entire chain of events. Money that would have changed my life 2 years ago, but now felt almost insignificant compared to what I'd accomplished on my own. "I appreciate the gesture," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure I need that kind of financial help anymore." "Marcus, please," Mom said, fresh tears starting to flow. "We know we can't undo the hurt we caused, but we want to try to make it right. You've built something incredible with your consulting business, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have supported you when you asked for help." Dad nodded vigorously. "Your mother's right. We failed you as parents when we turned down your loan request. We got distracted by Jessica's immediate needs and forgot about your long-term goals." I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw two people genuinely wrestling with the consequences of their choices. They'd watched their daughter's marriage crumble, seen their son-in-law's professional disgrace, and witnessed the destruction of what they'd thought was a happy family. What they didn't know was that I'd orchestrated most of that destruction myself. "There is something you could do for me," I said finally. Both of them straightened up, eager to hear how they could make amends. "I'd like you to understand why your decision hurt me so much. Not just the money, but what it represented." Over the next hour, I explained how their rejection of my loan request had felt like a rejection of my character and potential. I described the years of being the responsible child, of working harder than Jessica but receiving less recognition, of building my business without the family support I'd hoped for. My parents listened without interrupting, absorbing criticism they'd probably never fully considered before. When I finished, Dad was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," he said simply. "We took your responsibility for granted and rewarded Jessica's impulsiveness. We sent the message that poor planning and bad decisions would be rescued, while good planning and hard work would be ignored." "We're proud of what you've accomplished," Mom added, "but we should have been supporting you all along, not just recognizing your success after the fact." The conversation ended with tentative plans for them to tour my new house the following weekend. I didn't mention that it was the same house their money had originally purchased for Jessica and Derek. That revelation could wait for another time, when the irony would have maximum impact. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how completely my plan had succeeded. Derek was unemployed, divorced, and financially ruined. Jessica was back to living with our parents, starting over from nothing. And now my parents were not only apologizing for their original decision, but offering me the exact amount they'd given Jessica. But perhaps the most satisfying element was how natural it all seemed to everyone involved. My parents saw Derek's failures as the inevitable result of his weak character, not as the product of systematic sabotage. Jessica blamed Derek's incompetence and their marital problems for the collapse of her marriage. Derek himself seemed to view his downfall as a series of unfortunate circumstances, rather than the execution of a carefully planned revenge. The following week, I received one final call from Derek. He was calling from a motel room somewhere in Nevada, where he'd moved to escape his creditors and start over in a state with no connections to his past failures. "Marcus, I just wanted to thank you again for everything you did to help me," he said, his voice hollow but sincere. "Buying the house, giving me that job opportunity, trying to make things work between me and Jessica. I know none of it was your fault that things went wrong." "Everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves," I replied, delivering the line with perfect sincerity. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realize now that I wasn't ready for the kind of responsibility you gave me. I let my personal problems interfere with my professional judgment, and I made mistakes that hurt your company's reputation." Derek went on to apologize for the Riverside manufacturing disaster, for the building violations in Sacramento, and for generally being a disappointment as both an employee and a brother-in-law. He took full responsibility for every failure, never suspecting that most of his mistakes had been carefully orchestrated. "I hope someday I can prove to you and Jessica that I'm better than the person I was this past year," he concluded. "Maybe when I get my life sorted out, we can rebuild some kind of relationship." After hanging up, I sat in my office, the office I'd built without my parents' help, in the company I'd grown beyond their wildest expectations, and considered Derek's words. He still believed that redemption was possible, that he could somehow return to the life he'd lost. But Derek didn't understand the fundamental truth about revenge. Once you've lost everything, the person who took it from you gets to decide whether you ever get it back. I walked to the window of my corner office and looked out at the Portland skyline, thinking about justice, family, and the price of underestimating the quiet ones who always seem to have everything under control. My parents had learned to regret their favoritism. Jessica had learned that impulsive decisions have lasting consequences. And Derek had learned that some opportunities are too good to be true. As for me, I'd learned that patience, planning, and strategic thinking could accomplish more than anger or confrontation ever could. I'd also learned that revenge, when properly executed, doesn't feel like revenge at all. It feels like justice finally being served. The inheritance that should have been mine was now funding the life I'd built without it. The house my parents' money had bought was now mine at a discount, and the family that had once overlooked my potential was now asking for my forgiveness. It had taken 2 years, but every debt had been paid in full. And the best part, Derek was still thanking me for the privilege. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you, right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.